thank you. I want to thank the library for inviting me here. For me, it's a trip back in time in many respects, as you'll soon see. And it's a great privilege to be able to talk about this. I've never written about it, and it's about the partnership between Mr. Hoover and Harry Truman. Let's start with a little perspective. There had not been many presidential partnerships. Perhaps the most noteworthy in the country's early history was Thomas Jefferson and James Madison. Their great triumph was the Louisiana Purchase, with Jefferson as president and Madison as his Secretary of State. But the outcome of their collaboration throughout, all the way through into Madison's terms, was in other areas not happy at all. Their 1807 embargo inflicted terrible economic damage on the nation and inculcated a New England suspicion and hatred of the South, which had not a little to do with starting the Civil War. President Madison's War of 1812 was a series of military disasters, mostly caused by President Jefferson's, former President Jefferson's, antipathy to professional navies and armies, which brought the nation to the edge of dissolution. That's a misunderstood war. It's really not a happy story at all. Andrew Jackson, on the other hand, seemed to have found an ideal partner, successor in Martin Van Buren. But the super slick, totally political New Yorker waffled fatally on a major Jackson goal, bringing Texas into the Union. In 1840, Old Hickory, as they called Jackson, watched with grim indifference while Van Buren's run for a second term ended in a rout. In 1844, Jackson endorsed James K. Polk for president, making it cruelly clear that he agreed with those who called Van a used-up man. Theodore Roosevelt also seemed at first to have found a happy partner in his successor, William Howard Taft. Oh, they were such wonderful friends. But this soon proved to be an illusion, as Taft turned out to be much more conservative than Roosevelt, and pretty soon Roosevelt was running for a third term as a Taft-denouncing progressive. In 1945, you could see why Americans were justifiably amazed to see a partnership between two presidents from opposing parties that worked without recriminations or regrets. The presidents, as I'm sure you already anticipate, were Herbert Hoover and Harry Truman. What makes this story especially fascinating to me is the opportunity I had to hear Mr. Truman and his wife Bess and his daughter Margaret talk about it. The year of this event, you might say, was 1970. Having published a successful memoir of her White House years, Margaret Truman decided to write a biography of her father. Mr. Truman had been out of office for almost 20 years. His presidency seemed eclipsed by the turmoil of Vietnam and the youth rebellion of the 1960s, what one historian has called America's national nervous breakdown. Margaret asked her father if he had any suggestions about whom she might find to help her with the writing and research. "Try this fellow Thomas Fleming," Mr. Truman said. "I just read his biography of Thomas Jefferson. It was a good job." That remark soon translated into contracts and deadlines, and I found myself on a plane to Kansas City with Margaret Truman, whom I liked immensely, I might add, from the day we met. Within an hour of landing, I was sitting in the tiny room that the Trumans called the library in their rambling 19th century house in Independence, Missouri. Mr. Truman poured me a dark bourbon and water and handed glasses of somewhat lighter hue to Mrs. Truman and Margaret. He raised his own dark glass and said, "Young man, there's only one thing I don't know about you. Have you always been a Democrat?" His tone was wry, almost joshing, but I instantly sensed it was a serious question. I gave it a serious answer. "Mr. President," I said, "my father was sheriff of Hudson County and leader of the 6th Ward in Frank Hague's Jersey City. As far as I know, no one in the family has ever voted anything but the straight ticket." That That's exactly what I wanted to hear, President Truman said. We clinked glasses. There was no need for us to discuss the similarities and the differences between the Hague political machine and the one that had politically baptized Mr. Truman, Boss Tom Pendergast's Kansas City enterprise. So began two of the most memorable weeks of my life. My Democratic Party bona fides convinced both Mr. Truman and his wife that I could be trusted as a semi-member of the family. More than once, during lunch or dinner, Mrs. Truman would put down her knife and fork and beam at me across the table. "Tom," she would say, "and you never voted anything but the straight ticket. I like that." This is how I learned that, contrary to the myth of political naivete that Bess Truman cultivated to frustrate and confuse reporters, she was, if possible, more of a pal than her husband. She loved all aspects of politics, and it was equally evident that the president seldom made a political decision without consulting her. I tell you all this not only because I hope it's good listening, but it makes it all the more astonishing that Harry Truman, a man for whom the Democratic Party was almost a religion, as it was in my family, launched a collaboration with Herbert Hoover, a man whose name had become synonymous with the word Republican used as a combination epithet and Democratic war cry. At this point, we citizens of the 21st century might benefit from a brief refresher course on how Herbert Hoover acquired this awful identity. During World War I, as we've already heard to some extent, he'd won fame as the man who abandoned a successful business career to rescue battered Belgium and other European countries from starvation. German armies had rampaged through the tiny nation, and the British Navy stubbornly refused to alter its all-or-nothing blockade. When Woodrow Wilson took America into World War I in 1917, he made Mr. Hoover his food czar, a hugely important job. At the end of the war, Mr. Hoover joined Wilson at the Paris Peace Conference, and there he worked additional miracles, feeding a defeated Germany in spite, again, of this vindictive British blockade in this case. They didn't raise the blockade for a year after the armistice, and German children were literally starving in the streets. Wilson's feud with the Republican Congress over the peace treaty made him a symbol of political ineptitude. But the newspapers continued to call Mr. Hoover the great engineer. All this time, no one knew if Mr. Hoover belonged to a political party. It didn't seem to matter. The New York Times ranked him as one of the 10 greatest living Americans. One ambitious young Democrat, Franklin D. Roosevelt, who was Woodrow Wilson's Assistant Secretary of the Navy, publicly declared he'd be honored to run as vice president on a ticket headed by Mr. Hoover. He was more than a little mortified when Mr. Hoover revealed he was a Republican. Until he became president in 1928, Mr. Hoover seemed to have a magic touch that repeatedly turned daunting tasks to political gold. But when the stock market crashed in the fall of 1929, his luck ran out, seemingly forever. The Democrats assigned a modern genius named Charles Michelson to demonize the great engineers. The Depression and its immense suffering was wholly Mr. Hoover's fault, went this party line. A stream of vituperation and slander portrayed the former savior of starving millions as the cold, cruel, uncaring servant of the ruling class. Franklin D. Roosevelt was an enthusiastic backer of this campaign, and he did not change his mind when he stepped over Mr. Hoover's political corpse to reach the White House. Throughout the 1930s, Mr. Hoover, again, I think we've seen glimpses of this, remained a stubborn critic of Roosevelt's New Deal, repeatedly pointing out his basic idea that the billions poured into the WPA and other agencies had not solved the Great Depression. When Europe erupted into another world war and Pearl Harbor made America a participant, not a few people urged Mr. Roosevelt to dismiss this ongoing feud and invite Mr. Hoover into the government to help deal with looming manpower and food shortages. FDR's response was savage, as we've already heard. He said that he was not Jesus Christ, and he was not going to raise Herbie, as he called him, from the dead. So Mr. Hoover remained in limbo for the duration of Mr. Roosevelt's third and fourth terms in the White House. When FDR died suddenly on April 12, 1945, which I will add, I was about 15 or 16 at the time. It was, no, 17. It was really the greatest political shock of my life. The whole nation was totally stunned by this. I remember people just talked to each other on the street to say, "What do you think? What's going to happen?" There was no possibility that somebody could replace this man. And in reality, he left Vice President Harry Truman a two-front war that was almost won in Europe and the Pacific, but also a wrecked European continent, teetering on starvation in the looming shadow of a new tyranny, Soviet-Russian communism. Only the united voices of the Democratic Party's leader had persuaded FDR to jettison liberal Vice President Henry Wallace, a decapitation about which I've been told some Iowans still brood. In retaliation, Roosevelt had displayed a minimal courtesy bordering on contempt toward Mr. Truman. In the angry words of Bess Truman, FDR had told her husband nothing about the inner workings of the war and his dealings with Joseph Stalin. The new president did not even know we were close to acquiring an atomic bomb. As various members of the Roosevelt cabinet brought Mr. Truman up to some sort of parity with the current military and political situation, the man from Missouri realized he would soon be facing crises that involved the future of Europe and Asia. Joseph Stalin was greedily turning every East European country that his armies occupied into communist satellites of Moscow. He had agents active in every nation in Western Europe preaching the Soviet line and was casting greedy eyes toward China and Japan. On the day Mr. Roosevelt died, Mr. Hoover sent President Truman a telegram saying he joined all Americans in wishing him the strength to deal with your gigantic task. A second sentence hinted he was eager to help him solve this daunting challenge. You have the right to call for any service in aid of our country. Mr. Truman replied with thanks for these good wishes and an additional sentence that almost certainly raised Mr. Hoover's hopes. I assure you, I shall feel free to call upon you. Thanks for the offer. Both these evidences of good intentions soon became entangled in politics. When Mr. Truman told the members of his White House staff, all inherited from Mr. Roosevelt, that he was thinking of discussing the chaos in Europe with Mr. Hoover, there was an ideological explosion that almost blew out the walls of the Oval Office. Steve Early, the press secretary, virtually screamed his hatred of Mr. Hoover. He descanted on the way that Mr. Hoover had never deigned to visit the White House to pay his respects to FDR when he visited Washington since after he left the presidency. A pretty absurd idea, I might add, since they were, attacking each other in public constantly. But another item was Secretary of the Interior Harold Ickes was equally vociferous about not welcoming Mr. Hoover to do anything. With malice aforethought, Ickes had taken Mr. Hoover's name off the huge dam on the Colorado River that had almost been completed when he left office in 1933. Mr. Truman retreated in the face of this explosion. He told friends of Mr. Hoover, such as Secretary of War Henry Stimson, in his cabinet, that it might be better if the ex-president came to the White House on his own. He could assure him of a cordial welcome. Mr. Hoover stubbornly and understandingly rebuffed this idea when it was suggested to him by Stimson and millionaire Bernard Baruch, who had made a career of advising presidents. When other Hoover advocates tried to influence Steve Early, that gentleman snarled that Hoover would be welcome in the White House only if he crawled in on his hands and knees. Some of this filtered into the Oval Office, and on May 24, 1945, President Truman decided to solve it in an entirely original way. That evening, up in his little office in the presidential quarters, he wrote a 2-sentence letter to Mr. Hoover in longhand. "My dear Mr. President," he wrote, "if you should be in Washington, I would be most happy to talk over the European food situation with you. Also, it would be a pleasure for me to become acquainted with you." Mr. Truman found an envelope and a stamp and slipped out of the White House and dropped the letter in the nearest mailbox. No one, including his Secret Service escort, noticed the maneuver. On May 26th, Mr. Hoover responded to President Truman's invitation with a longhand letter of his own. "Dear Mr. President, I have your most kind invitation of the 24th. I will be glad to come to Washington any time to meet with you at your convenience, and I'm asking one of your secretaries to fix an hour." 2 days later, Margaret Truman, she told me this in her own lively words, was rushing out the front door of the White House on her way to a class at George Washington University. She was in her senior year, majoring in history. At the door, she almost collided with a heavy-set man with a rather cheerful expression on his face. He stepped aside, and she zoomed into a waiting car, driven, of course, by a Secret Service agent. That night at dinner, Margaret told her father about her encounter and wondered who this stranger was. He looked important, she said, and she assumed he had visited Mr. Truman. The president's eyes twinkled. He loved to tease his daughter. It's not often a mere high school graduate gets a chance to teach something to a history major, he said. "Before they start serving dinner, why don't you go downstairs and take a look at the portraits of the presidents in the main hall?" Margaret, always obedient, at least up to a point, rushed downstairs, and in less than a minute was face to face with a handsome painting of the morning's visitor. "Herbert Hoover!" she cried when she regained her chair at the dinner table. "Why in the world is the Democratic president talking to him?" "Because he knows a lot about some matters that could save tens of thousands of people from starvation," Mr. Truman said. "Also, it may give me a chance to right a great wrong that certain professional liberals in the Democratic Party has done to Mr. Hoover." Professional liberals, I should add, was a term that Mr. Truman used to describe the extreme left wing of the Democratic Party. The first topic that the ex-president and the president discussed was Europe's imminent mass starvation. Mr. Hoover divided the problem into 3 parts. First came the 200 million people in Eastern Europe who were being turned into unwilling communists. Feeding them was now Soviet Russia's problem. The rest of Europe was America's concern. Italy, Greece, and some nearby Mediterranean islands required separate treatment. But most important was northwestern Europe, France, Belgium, Holland, Denmark, Norway, and the American-occupied part of Germany. 100 million people lived there, and they were in desperate need of help. They needed 1 million tons of wheat per month to preserve them from anarchy and communism. There was only one solution, Mr. Hoover said. President Truman had to put the U.S. Army in command of the situation. They were the only people with the power and know-how to cut through the red tape and get the job done. He urged the immediate creation of a war council composed of leading politicians from the affected countries under the command of an American general. In the U.S., Mr. Hoover proposed the creation of a 3-man war council with similar red tape cutting powers. President Truman seemed to like both these bold ideas and asked Mr. Hoover to write memorandums outlining it. Unfortunately, Mr. Truman then sought Mr. Hoover's opinion of the American relationship with Russia and the ongoing war with Japan. We've heard already what they discussed on this point. Mr. Hoover then prepared the 4 memorandums and made sure they were delivered to the president's new press secretary. He was Mr. Truman's close personal friend and veteran newsman, Charles Ross. Mr. Hoover told Ross he wanted to avoid having these communications pass through what he called the many hands of the current White House mechanism. In a word, Mr. Hoover still regarded New Deal Democrats such as Steve Early as enemies, with good reason, I should add. Mr. Truman had too much on his mind in the spring of 1945 to do more than write a mild comment in his personal diary about this meeting with Mr. Hoover. Before he could act on his recommendations, he was engulfed by events. First came his conference with Stalin and the new British leader Clement Attlee at Potsdam. Entangled with those momentous days was a decision on whether or not to use the atomic bomb to end the war with Japan. The New Dealers in the cabinet and on his White House staff, who had tried to block his meeting with Mr. Hoover, reacted with even more negative horror when Mr. Truman proposed to abandon Roosevelt's policy of unconditional surrender and work out a negotiated peace with an obviously defeated Japan. This is one of the first examples of Harry Truman's ability to think for himself. He was rejecting Mr. Hoover's advice about unconditional surrender and, of course, the great principle which Franklin D. Roosevelt had enunciated. The Navy's admirals and a few other people supported this idea, but the Army's Air Force generals argued for the atomic bomb. And more important, the New Dealers in and out of the cabinet told Truman that he would destroy the Democratic Party if he abandoned unconditional surrender. Reluctantly, the president chose the atomic bomb as the best guarantee of a swift peace. General Leslie Groves, the man in charge of the top secret program, predicted it would take 2 bombs to convince the Japanese. And he was right, although Mr. Truman devoutly hoped that would not be the case. But his misgivings about the bomb became visible when he was pushed to use a 3rd bomb, which was the last bomb we had, incidentally. Mr. Truman refused. In a little-known letter, he replied he did not want to incinerate any more women and children. These huge events, culminating in what Winston Churchill called an iron curtain across Europe and the occupation of Japan by General Douglas MacArthur and an American army, did little or nothing to alter the crisis that had prompted Mr. Truman to write to Mr. Hoover. By the end of 1945, starvation at its most demoralizing threatened Europe and Asia. To deal with this world food panic, as it was now called, Mr. Truman asked Mr. Hoover to chair a famine emergency committee, and he accepted. On March 1st, Secretary of Agriculture Clinton Anderson and Secretary of Commerce Henry Wallace joined Mr. Hoover and Mr. Truman in the White House to announce the committee's creation. Mr. Truman said it was the most important meeting he had convened since he became president. Henry Wallace's presence was particularly significant as a spokesman for the Democratic Party's left wing. Where the dislike of Mr. Hoover remained intense, it was shrewd politics to have his apparent approval of Mr. Hoover's leadership role. Words are often a necessary thing, but actions speak louder behind the scenes, and Mr. Hoover was soon dismayed by Mr. Truman's inability to deal with various New Dealers who refused to cooperate with Mr. Hoover. Chester Bowles of the Office of Price Administration, for instance, declined to relinquish his control of food prices, which made it impossible for Mr. Hoover to do anything in America. Hoover began telling friends he'd never seen or imagined such a mediocre president. He didn't understand Mr. Truman's agonizing dilemma as he tried to strike an impossible balance between his own opinions and the aggressive New Deal voices surrounding him. In spite of his pessimism, Mr. Hoover soon discovered his relationship with Mr. Truman would launch the busiest and most important 3 months of his life since he left the White House. Mr. Truman gave him and his staff a U.S. Air Force plane and a directive to visit nations around the world to discover firsthand the help they needed to avoid a famine. On April 19, 1946, Mr. Truman made the assignment more than official by announcing Mr. Hoover's mission in a speech over all 4 radio networks. If this wasn't welcoming him back into the government, what was it? Mr. Hoover responded with a speech later the same night over NBC radio. Both men appealed to the American people's pity and generosity to help them avoid an international catastrophe. In the next 57 days, the 72-year-old Hoover And the specifics of this we heard some general discussion of it. The 72-year-old Hoover visited 22 countries and conferred with 7 kings and 36 prime ministers. He gave 40 press conferences and made 24 speeches. It was an astonishing performance for a man his age. Back in the White House, his presidential partner wondered that the strain might be too much for him. But Mr. Hoover was having a wonderful time. From Cairo, where he reassured Mr. Truman that he could keep going, Mr. Hoover flew to Asia. There he visited India, Japan, and several other countries. And finally, he winged across the Pacific to San Francisco and on to Washington. In the White House, Mr. Hoover brought President Truman heartening news. Pooling surplus grains from America and other countries, they could reduce the food shortage around the world by 2/3. When Mr. Truman told him Russia was unlikely to cooperate, Mr. Hoover promptly embarked on a trip to South America, vowing, if necessary, to eat what he called Argentine dirt, to persuade them to part with wheat from their overflowing granaries. He soon talked them into giving him 1.6 million tons. When Mr. Hoover submitted his final report to Mr. Truman on May 15, 1946, the President praised it extravagantly. "You and your associates have provided a great service to humanity," he wrote. A still galvanized Hoover spoke to the nation on May 17, again pleading with the American people to reduce their food consumption to save millions from starvation. It was an inspiring climax to his mission, and President Truman capped it with another warm letter of praise. Suddenly, Mr. Hoover realized, every molecule in my body yells at me that it is tired. He left Washington for a well-deserved rest, but the momentum he created with his report soon acquired a power of its own. Crucial supplies of wheat and other foods began pouring across the seas to the countries in need. Chaos and rampant communism was averted. The Truman-Hoover partnership, meanwhile, was far from over. One might even say it experienced a rebirth after the Republicans routed the Democrats in the 1946 midterm elections and won control of both branches of Congress for the first time in 16 years. Not many biographers have understood the way this Democratic defeat liberated President Harry Truman. As he saw it, the voters had rejected the excesses and aberrations of the wartime New Deal with its wild multiplication of agencies and federal power and its reckless talk of a New Deal for the world. He was never a believer in these excesses. He was now free to be president in his own right. Early in 1947, President Truman did something that really was a minor matter in the context of the world crises that we're discussing. But in the context of our story, it says a good deal about Mr. Truman's subtle but real sense of liberation. Several members of the new Republican majority proposed to restore Mr. Hoover's name to the Colorado River Dam. Mr. Truman promptly sent word to a New Jersey Republican senator that he would sign the bill, which he did with great pleasure. While this restoration was in progress, Mr. Truman was on another mission for the president, an extensive visit to Germany and Austria to propose ways to restore economic prosperity to these defeated nations. Again, he succeeded marvelously. And behind the scenes, he was playing a major role in persuading the Republican-controlled Congress to cooperate with these and other programs. 10 days after the restoration of Mr. Hoover's name to the Great Dam, he was invited to the Gridiron Club dinner for the first time in 15 years. This was an annual event hosted by the Washington Press Corps in which politics is the main subject, often mixed with barbed humor. When the master of ceremonies asked Mr. Hoover his opinion of the Democratic president, some people may have hoped that there would be a wry remark suggesting Mr. Truman was finding out how it felt when public opinion turned against his party. Instead, Herbert Hoover praised Mr. Truman's high service to his country. Amid the thousands of crises that sweep toward America from abroad, he praised Mr. Truman for standing firm with his feet planted in American soil. A deeply moved Harry Truman took Herbert Hoover's copy of the program and wrote, "With esteem and appreciation to a great man." It was a unique tribute to the deepening friendship between the two presidents. But domestic politics still cast a looming shadow. When Mr. Truman ran for re-election in 1948, he made the Republican Congress his main target, and his speechwriters soon began using some of the epithets against Mr. Hoover. At one point, Mr. Truman asked people to remember the Herbert Hoover car of the 1930s. This was a tin Lizzie pulled by a mule. At another point, he described Mr. Hoover as a great engineer who would back the national train into the public waiting room, creating panic, depression, and despair. It was an enormous tribute to Mr. Hoover's political sophistication that he was able to dismiss this vituperation as campaign rhetoric. He was helped by a message Mr. Truman sent him saying he simply did not have time to rewrite his speeches, which was pretty much the case. Another reason was Mr. Hoover's lack of enthusiasm for the Republican candidate, Thomas E. Dewey. But most important of all was the job that Mr. Hoover had begun doing before the campaign began. He had agreed to head a bipartisan commission to reorganize the federal government. Some leading Democrats tried to persuade Mr. Truman to block Mr. Hoover's appointment. Mr. Truman replied that Hoover was the best man I know of to tackle this large task. He was confident that Mr. Hoover would do the job for me. Notice that presidential tone. At the election of 1948 churned to a climax, Mr. Truman amazed everyone with his gains in the polls. Some Democrats on this commission talked of junking the whole enterprise, mainly to get rid of Mr. Hoover. When Mr. Truman won his astounding victory, a Hoover staff man persuaded the Democratic insider to put through a call to Missouri to find out what would happen next. The answer was a strong affirmative from the man from Independence. He would put all his victorious prestige behind Mr. Hoover's recommendations. Over the next year, there was still a lot of arguments across the aisle in Congress, but more than 70% of Mr. Hoover's recommendations became law, creating what some historians call the managerial presidency, with Congress as sort of a board of directors and the president as the executive in charge of proposing and working out the details of the laws they passed. It's more complicated than that, of course, but it's not a bad summary. In the next years, the two presidents disagreed publicly about America's foreign policy. You've already heard about this, too. Mr. Hoover favored creating a fortress America and so forth, and Mr. Truman wanted engagement with the anti-communists and went for the NATO and Marshall plans. But the Hoover-Truman friendship survived these strains. Mr. Hoover joined Eleanor Roosevelt in the dedication of Mr. Truman's library. In 1962, Mr. Truman came here to West Branch to help dedicate Mr. Hoover's library. Over the years, they exchanged letters on many tactics. The most important of these communications, however, came from Mr. Hoover in late December 1962. He began by thanking Mr. Truman for the warm, handwritten inscription on a copy of his sort of second memoir, Mr. Citizen. But Mr. Hoover felt impelled, he said, to add something more. Swiftly, he summed up his career in public service, starting in 1914, and his disappointment with his offer to help serve during World War II. Then came words that recalled the roots of their friendship. When you came to the White House, within a month, you opened the door to me to the only profession I know, public service, and you undid some disgraceful actions that had been taken in the prior years. For all this, and for your friendship, I am deeply grateful. Mr. Truman replied that Mr. Hoover's letter left him overcome. You state the situation better than I could, he wrote. I'll quote you. For your friendship, I am deeply grateful. Americans need to know more about this unique political experience. It's rich in wisdom for the politicians of 2012, and I suspect the riches will be equally evident to the politicians of 3012. Thank you very much.